Rain had been falling since dusk, a steady, rhythmic tapping against the high windows of the old hospital. The ward smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp wool, the kind of mingled scents that seemed to settle in older buildings, never quite washed away. Outside, the street lamps blurred into halos through the rain-slick glass, and the corridors were half-lit, their shadows deep and slow-moving. It was just after midnight when Nurse Evelyn Moore began her rounds. She was the sort of nurse who never rushed, who believed patients could sense hurried footsteps and be unsettled by them. Her shoes made a soft, deliberate sound against the linoleum as she moved from bed to bed, checking charts, smoothing blankets, and adjusting the hiss of oxygen valves. At the far end of the ward, 2 beds stood side by side, their thin metal frames painted a dull cream that had yellowed with time. In them lay 2 young women, identical in every detail, the same pale oval faces, the same dark lashes resting on their cheeks, the same small movement of breath. The twins had been admitted a week earlier for observation, and though Evelyn had seen many unusual cases, their presence carried a peculiar stillness. She paused at the first bed, noting the rise and fall of the patient's chest. Then she stepped to the second. It was here she noticed it, even in sleep, the girls seemed to mirror each other perfectly. When one's head tilted slightly to the left, the other's shifted by the same fraction of an inch. When one's fingers twitched against the sheet, the other's hand gave the faintest answering tremor. Evelyn leaned closer, studying the nearer twin's face. A strand of hair had fallen across her cheek. The nurse reached out to move it, her fingertips light. That was when she heard it, a whisper so faint she thought at first it was the rustle of the rain against the glass. "We are not 2, the voice breathed, the syllables spilling slowly, as though they cost effort to form. "We are 1. Evelyn froze. She glanced instinctively at the other bed. The second twin lay motionless, lips closed, but the words still seemed to hang in the air, vibrating in the quiet like the afterring of a bell. She stepped back, her hand gripping the edge of the nearest bed frame. The sound had been low, almost like someone talking in their sleep, yet there was something deliberate about it. A tone that didn't feel adrift in dreaming. In her years as a nurse, Evelyn had heard plenty of strange things from sleeping patients, murmured fragments of memory, groaned pleas, nonsense syllables. But she could not recall ever hearing something so precise, so disturbingly declarative. She leaned in again, this time toward the second twin. Nothing. Just the steady rhythm of breathing. But then, almost imperceptibly, the first twin's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Evelyn straightened, trying to dismiss the chill that had run across her shoulders. Perhaps she had misheard. Perhaps her mind, dulled by the long night shift, was turning harmless murmurs into something strange. She made a note in the chart, light vocalization during sleep, and forced herself to move on. Yet the word stayed with her as she crossed the ward, her penlight beam moving over pale faces and folded hands. "We are not 2. We are 1. Outside the hospital, the rain began to fall harder, tapping now like fingers against the glass. Down the hallway, somewhere out of sight, a clock chimed once. Evelyn returned to the nurse's station and set down her clipboard. She tried to focus on her paperwork, but her mind kept drifting back to the twins. What had they meant? She remembered their first day of admission, how they had walked in side by side, their steps perfectly synchronized, their eyes scanning the room together before settling on the same spot. Even then, she'd felt an odd tightness in her chest, as though she were witnessing not 2 separate people but a single, doubled presence. She glanced toward their end of the ward. From this distance, she could see only the outlines of the beds, the faint shapes beneath the covers. The overhead lights flickered briefly, a quick shiver of shadow and glow, before steadying again. Evelyn decided she would check on them once more before settling into the next set of notes. She rose and began walking down the ward, the floor creaking faintly beneath her careful steps. When she reached the twins' beds, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The second twin, the one who had been still earlier, now had her head tilted to the right. The first twin's head was tilted too, in the exact same angle but mirrored, as though their movements formed a perfect symmetry across an invisible axis. Evelyn stood there for a moment, her breath held. Then, very softly, the second twin's lips parted. "We've been here before," she whispered. Evelyn's skin prickled. The voice was quiet but awake, the kind of whisper that carried awareness. "When?" Evelyn asked, without meaning to. The girl didn't answer. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing even. Across the small gap between their beds, the first twin's lips twitched, almost as if suppressing a laugh. Evelyn stepped back again, her own voice caught somewhere between a question and a prayer. She looked from one girl to the other. The resemblance was uncanny, yes, identical twins often were, but there was something in their stillness, in the way they seemed to occupy the same invisible current of thought, that felt heavier than ordinary likeness. She made no further notes that night. By the time her shift ended, the rain had eased to a thin mist, and the first pale light of morning had begun to seep between the buildings outside. As Evelyn gathered her things, she cast one last glance toward the far end of the ward. The twins were still there, lying in their perfect mirrored poses, untouched by the stirrings of the waking hospital. Evelyn would later try to explain the whispers away, fatigue, the tricks of half-heard sounds in a long night. But deep down, she knew she had heard what she heard. And she would carry the words with her for the rest of her life. "We are not two. We are one." The town was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour, yet old enough that every street seemed to carry the weight of more than one lifetime. Wooden houses leaned gently with age, their paint peeling in thin, curling strips. The air smelled of salt and cedar, for the harbor was never far, and the wind brought the sea into every open window. It was the kind of place where history didn't feel like something kept in books, it lived in the brick of the old meeting hall, in the cobblestone lanes that twisted like roots, and in the stubborn gossip that could survive for decades. The town's name was Ashford Bay, though older residents still called it by the original colonial name, given when the first Puritan settlers arrived. Their descendants remained here, their family lines stitched into the town's identity as tightly as the mortar in its church walls. On Sunday mornings, the bells of St. Bridget's carried over the rooftops, calling the faithful to the same stone church that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. On weekdays, fishermen in wool caps mended their nets along the dock, watched by the gulls that circled above. In winter, when the snow came in from the sea, the streets would fall silent except for the muffled thud of boots on packed ice. It was a place content with its own rhythms, resistant to change, and suspicious of anything, or anyone, that disturbed its quiet order. The twins' family lived on the northern edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the road turned to gravel. The house itself was modest, 2 floors, weather-beaten clapboard, and a sloping roof that needed repair. The shutters were always drawn in the evening, and the front porch sagged just enough to creak under the weight of a single person. Inside, the walls were hung with faded photographs, stern-looking ancestors, stiff in their best clothes, staring directly into the lens as though trying to outlast time. Their father, Samuel Turner, was a man of few words, tall and stoop-shouldered, with hands rough from years working in the shipyard. He rarely joined in conversation at church socials, preferring to stand at the edges, smoking a pipe and watching. The town knew little about his thoughts, only that he had a habit of pausing before speaking, as though weighing each word against some private scale. Their mother, Helen, came from an old Ashford Bay family. People whispered that her grandmother had the sight, the ability to know things before they happened, though Helen never spoke of it. She was quieter than her husband, and when she did speak, it was with a soft, deliberate tone, as if afraid of saying too much. Her eyes often lingered on the twins in a way that was not entirely maternal. There was care, yes, but also a hint of study, like a scholar observing something rare and fragile. The twins, Anna and Elspeth, were born in the upstairs bedroom one gray morning in November, the tide high against the rocks. Helen insisted on keeping them close, even as infants, rarely allowing them to be apart. Neighbors who visited in those early days remarked on how the girls would turn their heads toward each other at the smallest sound, sometimes locking eyes with an expression far older than their newborn faces. As they grew, the girls became a familiar sight in town, always together, hand in hand, walking with a measured pace that made them seem older than they were. They had the same dark hair, cut blunt at the shoulders, and the same pale skin that flushed easily in the cold. People joked, at first, that even their laughter sounded the same, a quick, breathy sound that vanished almost as soon as it began. At the one-room schoolhouse, they sat side by side in the front row. Miss Adler, the schoolteacher, tried on the first day to seat them separately, thinking it would encourage independence. But by the end of the week she put them back together. It was easier that way, she said, though she didn't explain why. Older residents, those who remembered the town's stories of strange happenings, began to notice more. The way the girls seemed to respond to questions with a single glance between them. The way they sometimes turned their heads at exactly the same moment, as if hearing something no one else could. And the way they would speak, softly, quickly, almost in unison, when they thought no one was listening. Ashford Bay was no stranger to whispers. Generations earlier, in the 1700s, there had been trials, not as famous as Salem's, but enough to stain the records. A few women accused of unnatural practices, a few men blamed for storms or bad harvests. Most of the town had forgotten those names, but in certain households, the stories remained. There were those who quietly believed that blood carried more than just physical likeness, that certain traits, certain curses or gifts, could pass unseen from one generation to the next. Helen's family name, the older folk recalled, appeared more than once in those records. Still, no one spoke openly about the twins in those early years. They were simply the Turner girls, clever and polite, if a little strange. The town liked its mysteries unspoken. It was in this setting, the salted wind off the bay, the careful politeness of neighbors, the deep root of tradition, that the twins' lives unfolded. Every lane they walked was one their grandparents had walked. Every face they saw at the market was a face that had watched them grow from infants to young girls. Ashford Bay was the sort of place where time didn't move in lines but in circles, and where the unusual could exist quietly, so long as it didn't demand to be noticed. For years, the Turner family fit neatly into that pattern. Samuel kept to his work, Helen kept her shutters drawn, and the twins kept each other's company. If there was anything unusual about them, it stayed behind the walls of the weathered house on the northern edge of town. But even in a place as guarded as Ashford Bay, some things cannot stay hidden forever. There would come a time when the twins' peculiar bond would no longer be something the town could ignore, a time when their shared shadow would stretch farther than anyone imagined. And when that time came, the town's old, unspoken history would rise quietly from beneath the surface, ready to claim its place in the story. Childhood for most in Ashford Bay was simple, mornings at the schoolhouse, afternoons helping with chores, evenings by the fire. For Anna and Elspeth Turner, it was much the same on the surface. They walked to school together, carrying matching satchels their mother had sewn from the same bolt of cloth. They returned home by the same narrow path along the marsh, where the reeds bent in the wind like rows of whispering figures. But even in their earliest years, there were signs, small, easily overlooked at first, that the Turner twins did not inhabit childhood the way other children did. Miss Adler, their teacher, noticed it during their first year in the schoolroom. When she asked a question aloud, both girls would glance at each other before answering, as though silently deciding who should speak. Sometimes they would respond in perfect unison, their voices blending so smoothly it was impossible to tell one from the other. It was not mimicry. It was something deeper, like they were drawing from a single well of thought. At recess, they played games the other children didn't understand, elaborate patterns of movement that seemed to follow rules no one else knew. If another child tried to join, the twins would stop mid-game, their expressions flat and unreadable, as though the spell had been broken. In the schoolyard, they often spoke to each other in what seemed at first to be nonsense syllables, a private language built from half-words and glances. Miss Adler suspected it was a form of cryptophagia, not uncommon among twins, but what unsettled her was how swiftly they could switch from that strange code to flawless English without a pause, as if slipping between worlds. At home, Helen observed the same peculiar bond. If Anna was sent upstairs to fetch something, Elspeth would sometimes call down from the kitchen with the answer before Anna had even returned. Once, when Elspeth cut her finger on a kitchen knife, Anna cried out from the next room before she saw the blood. Their father said little about it, only shaking his head when Helen mentioned such incidents. The other children in Ashford Bay began to keep a cautious distance. It wasn't that the twins were unkind, they could be polite, even gentle. But there was a sense among their peers that the Turner girls belonged to each other in a way that left no room for anyone else. By the age of 10, the girls had developed a habit of correcting each other's sentences in a way that seemed less like argument and more like adjustment, as if fine-tuning a shared memory. If Anna began a story, Elspeth would step in, adding a detail Anna had forgotten, or, more strangely, one Anna swore she was about to say. They claimed to remember the same dreams, often recounting them together, line for line, as though reciting from a script. One summer afternoon, they joined the other children in a game of hide-and-seek. Anna hid in the loft of the old boathouse near the pier, while Elspeth wandered toward the marsh. When the seeker found Anna and tapped her on the shoulder, Elspeth, half a mile away, emerged from the reeds at that exact moment, laughing as if she had been found herself. The other children whispered about it for weeks. Some of the older residents began to notice more troubling details. Mrs. Keene, who ran the general store, claimed she once saw the twins standing in opposite aisles, staring at each other across the shelves without speaking. They weren't looking at each other, she said later. It was like they were looking through each other, at something I couldn't see. Helen tried to shield them from the town's quiet curiosity. She discouraged sleepovers, saying the girls didn't settle well in other houses. She rarely allowed them to be apart for more than an hour. When asked, she said it was because they had been delicate as infants, prone to fevers. But in private, she admitted to herself that their health was not what worried her most. One autumn evening, during a rare storm that rattled the windows and shook the shutters, Helen entered their room to check on them. She found them sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing each other, their hands resting lightly on each other's knees. They were speaking in low voices, their words too quick and tangled for her to follow. When she asked what they were doing, they answered together, remembering. Remembering what? She asked. Us, they said. The years passed, but the strangeness only deepened. If one was scolded at school, the other would sulk for the rest of the day, though she had done nothing wrong. If one caught a cold, the other would begin coughing within hours. When one scraped her knee, the other would flinch and press her hand to the same spot, as though expecting to find blood. There were times, too, when they seemed to resist the limits of their small world. Helen once found them standing in the backyard at dawn, their faces turned toward the woods beyond the property line. When she asked what they were looking at, they both said, where we were. She reminded them they had never been in those woods without her or their father. The girls only smiled. In the Turner household, mealtimes became quiet affairs. The twins often ate slowly, their eyes meeting across the table, the corner of a smile tugging at one mouth only to be mirrored by the other. Their father, still silent on the matter, would occasionally clear his throat and change the subject, as though breaking whatever invisible thread connected them. By the time they reached adolescence, the town's whispers had grown softer but more persistent. Some called it just twin things. Others, remembering the older tales of Ashford Bay, thought of stranger explanations, two bodies sharing a single soul, or one soul born into the wrong body and split in two. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain, Anna and Elspeth moved through their early years as if they were halves of the same whole, each incomplete without the other. To speak to one was to speak, in some unseen way, to both. And though the town was content to let the oddities pass without comment, there was an unspoken understanding among those who watched closely, whatever bound the Turner twins together was stronger than blood, deeper than memory, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself in ways no one could ignore. It happened in late spring, the air thick with the scent of lilacs drifting in from the edge of town. School had ended early that day for repairs to the roof, and the Turner twins had been sent to their uncle's farm, a mile inland, to help bring in hay before the next rain. The barn was a high, narrow structure, its wooden frame darkened with age, and the loft smelled of dust and warm straw. Anna had climbed up first, the ladder creaking under her slight weight. Elspeth remained below, gathering the loose hay scattered across the floor, humming to herself. The light slanted in through the wide barn doors, casting long bars of shadow across the floorboards. From where she stood, Elspeth could hear Anna's movements above, the soft scrape of boots on the boards, the rustle of hay being shifted. Then there was a sharper sound, a sudden thud, followed by a gasp. Anna had slipped. The fall was short, but she landed hard, her leg twisting beneath her. She cried out, the pain sharp and immediate. But before her voice had even faded, Elspeth dropped the rake she had been holding and clutched her own leg with a strangled gasp. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward onto the straw. Their uncle, hearing the commotion, rushed in from the fields. He found Anna on the loft floor, pale and trembling, her right leg bent awkwardly. Below, Elspeth was curled on her side, her hands gripping her own right leg, her face as white as her sister's. At the small clinic in town, Dr. Harris examined them both. Anna's injury was obvious, a clean break in the tibia. Elspeth's leg, however, showed no sign of trauma. No swelling, no bruise, nothing to explain the pain she insisted was exactly the same as her sister's. She's in shock from seeing her sister hurt, the doctor told Helen. Sympathy pains. It's not unheard of. But when he tested Elspeth's other leg, she hardly reacted. When he pressed gently along the shin of the right, she winced in the exact same spots that made Anna flinch. Even as Anna's leg was being set in a plaster cast, Elspeth's eyes watered, her breath catching with every twist of the bone beneath the doctor's hands. Back at home, the twins were put to bed in the same room. Anna lay propped up on pillows, her leg elevated. Elspeth refused to sleep in the other bed, insisting on lying beside her sister. It's our leg, she told Helen when asked. We only have one. Helen tried to dismiss it as childish nonsense, but the words stuck with her. She noticed, over the next days, that whenever Anna shifted uncomfortably in her cast, Elspeth would mirror the movement. When Anna cried out in the night from a sudden pang, Elspeth would wake at the same instant, clutching the same spot. A week later, Samuel carried Anna outside to sit in the sun. Elspeth followed, limping slightly though she had no injury. A neighbor passing by asked after them, and Elspeth replied without hesitation, "We're getting better." The neighbor, noting the "we," glanced at Helen, who offered no explanation. In the evenings, Helen sometimes stood at the doorway of their room, watching them talk in low voices before sleep. She noticed how their hands would rest in the same place on the blanket, fingers curled in the same way. It was as though Anna's broken leg had drawn them even closer, fusing their movements into a single rhythm. The story began to spread, first among neighbors, then through the rest of the town. It was passed along in lowered voices, how both girls had felt the pain of a single injury, how the unhurt one had walked with a limp for days. Some called it uncanny. Others dismissed it as an exaggeration. Dr. Harris, though he did not say so openly, was unsettled. He had seen sympathy pains before, but never with such persistence or precision. He wrote a private note in Anna's file, possible shared somatic response. But took no further action. In small towns, it was often better not to stir things that couldn't be explained. The twins themselves seemed untroubled by the attention. When asked about it, they would simply smile and say, "It's because we're the same person." Their tone carried no trace of humor. It was a statement, not a joke. One afternoon, when Anna was well enough to sit outside alone, Elspeth wandered down to the marsh. She stayed there until the light began to fade, then returned quietly to the porch. "I missed us," she said to her sister, as if she had been gone for weeks instead of hours. By the time Anna's cast was removed, the incident had begun to fade from conversation. The town had other matters to occupy it, the summer storms, the slow decline of the fishing season, the annual church fair. But for those who had watched closely, the fracture had marked something. It was no longer a matter of private oddities or whispered family stories. There was now a moment, witnessed, recorded, undeniable, when the twins' strange bond had crossed the line from the curious to the inexplicable. Helen felt it most of all. She told herself it was over, that the broken leg was healed, that whatever strange echo had passed between them had been nothing more than the nerves of two girls too close for their own good. But sometimes, when she passed their room at night, she would hear them speaking softly in the dark, their voices blending until they were indistinguishable. And she could not help but think of Elspeth's words in the barn, said with the same certainty as if naming the sky or the sea, "It's our leg. We only have one." By the end of summer, the story of the twins' shared leg had become part of Ashford Bay's quiet folklore. It traveled the way such things always did in small towns, tucked between talk of weather and fishing yields, exchanged in low tones over churchyard fences or while choosing apples at the market. No one spoke of it directly to the Turners, but the moment Helen or Samuel walked into a shop, conversations bent and shifted, like the tide pulling back from shore. At first, the whispers carried a tone of wonder. Neighbors told the tale with raised brows and a faint smile, as if recounting a harmless curiosity. But over time, something in the telling changed. The smiles faded, replaced by a subtle narrowing of eyes. Questions crept in beneath the fascination: was it truly just a strange coincidence? Or was it something else, something less explainable, less comfortable? At the schoolhouse, Miss Adler began to notice how other children were watching the twins. Not with open fear, but with a sort of quiet calculation, as though trying to measure how much of the story was true. Some began avoiding them in games. Others, bolder, would ask, "If I pinch you, will your sister feel it?" Anna and Elspeth never seemed bothered. Sometimes they would answer, no, other times, yes. And more often still, they would say nothing at all, simply exchanging one of those glances that passed between them like a sealed letter. The first open attempt to address the matter came from Reverend Carter, the parish minister. After Sunday service, he approached Helen and Samuel in the narrow aisle between pews. His voice was low, his smile carefully fixed. "It's best," he said, "not to encourage unusual talk. The children should be guided toward the ordinary ways of life." Helen understood what he meant. The town had always prided itself on order, the steady keeping of traditions, the quiet acceptance of the world's mysteries so long as they stayed politely at the margins. Anything that unsettled that balance was gently, but firmly, pushed back into place. At home, Helen tried to take the Reverend's advice. She told the girls to avoid speaking about the broken leg or what had followed. "People like simple stories," she said. "It's better to give them one." The twins nodded, but there was a glint in their eyes, not defiance exactly, but something that said they had agreed only because they chose to. Still, small incidents kept feeding the whispers. In early autumn, the Turner family attended the harvest fair. There was music on the green, tables of pies and preserves, and a contest for the tallest sunflower. Near the cider stand, Mrs. Keene, who ran the general store, offered Anna a slice of pumpkin bread. Before the girl could answer, Elspeth, standing several paces away with her father, shook her head and said, "No, thank you." Mrs. Keene looked between them, unsettled. Another time, the twins were seen on opposite ends of the harbor pier. A fisherman later swore he had watched them lift their heads at the same instant, turning toward the same point on the horizon, though one faced east and the other west. Each new story traveled faster than the last. But when spoken aloud, it was always cushioned with a shrug, the kind people use when they wish to appear unbothered by something they can't explain. Helen began to feel the pressure most keenly at church. Conversations would quiet as she passed. Friends who once stopped by the house in the evenings began to send their regards instead of themselves. The invitations slowed, then stopped. One night, after the girls were asleep, Helen sat at the kitchen table with Samuel. The lamplight made shadows dance across the wood grain. "It's changing," she said. "They're watching us differently now. Samuel puffed on his pipe and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he muttered, "Let them watch." His tone was flat, but his eyes held the same unspoken worry she felt. The twins, for their part, seemed untouched by the shift. They walked through town as they always had, side by side, matching steps, glancing at each other before answering questions. If they noticed the looks that followed them, they gave no sign. In November, a traveling salesman passed through Ashford Bay, selling books and medical pamphlets from the back of his wagon. Among his wares was a slim volume about extraordinary psychological phenomena. A few townsfolk bought copies, and before long, there was a rumor that one of the case studies described a pair of sisters who believed themselves to be one person. No one could say where the case had taken place, but in the minds of the townspeople, the details began to blur with the Turner story. Helen heard the rumor from Mrs. Hargreaves, who brought it up while weighing flour at the counter. "Best not to let the girls read such things," she advised. "It puts ideas in their heads." By the first snow, the whispers had settled into the fabric of the town. They were no longer news, but neither had they faded. The twins' name would still be lowered into conversations, wrapped in speculation. Some dismissed it entirely. Others nodded slowly, as though recalling something from their own pasts, a family story, a superstition carried from another shore. Through it all, the twins remained as they had always been. When asked directly, they would repeat their refrain with the same quiet certainty: "We are not two. We are one." To most, it was a strange habit, a childish refusal to grow into separate selves. But for those who had seen the way Anna flinched when Elspeth scraped her hand, or how Elspeth's smile would flicker in the same instant as Anna's, the words carried a weight that could not be shrugged away. And while the town preferred the safety of denial, there was an unease beneath it, the kind that grows when a story refuses to end neatly, when it lingers at the edges of the ordinary, waiting to step inside. The winter that year was harsher than most. Snow draped the roofs of Ashford Bay in heavy folds, and the harbor froze along its edges, trapping boats like toys in a glass case. The streets were quieter than usual. People moved quickly between doorways, their breath curling in the air like smoke from unseen fires. It was during one such brittle afternoon that the stranger arrived. He came by train, a rare enough thing in itself, as the coastal line saw more freight than passengers in those months. The stationmaster, Mr. Greeley, remembered him well, a tall man with a dark wool overcoat, a case in one hand, and a scarf wound so tightly around his throat it almost seemed to hold his head in place. His name, he said, was Dr. Charles Hargrove, recently of Boston. He had business in town, though of a specialized nature. Hargrove was not the sort of man to blend into Ashford Bay. He had the polished manner of someone used to speaking before lecture halls, and a way of looking at things, and people, as if measuring their weight against some internal ledger. That evening, he took a room at Mrs. Keene's boarding house and, over supper, began asking quiet questions. At first, they were harmless inquiries about the fishing trade, the church, the tides. But before the pie had been served, his questions narrowed. Had she ever met the Turner twins? Were the stories about them exaggerated, or did they bear some truth? Mrs. Keene, who had been repeating the twins' story for nearly a year, found herself curiously reluctant to answer under his steady gaze. She muttered something about children's foolishness and changed the subject. But Hargrove's expression, a faint crease of interest between his brows, suggested he had learned exactly what he wanted. By the next day, his presence was known to the Turners. Helen was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw him walking up the path, boots crunching in the frost. He removed his hat politely but wasted no time with preamble. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "I have come a great distance to speak with your daughters. I have heard something remarkable, and I wish to understand it better." Helen hesitated. The Reverend's warning still echoed in her mind, but there was something in Hargrove's voice, an absence of mockery, a calmness that felt almost like respect. She told him Samuel was at the dock but that the girls were inside, finishing their lessons. They met in the sitting room. Anna sat on the settee, hands folded in her lap, Elspeth perched on the armrest beside her, swinging one foot in small arcs. Hargrove introduced himself, his eyes moving between them with the precision of a man examining twin specimens. "I understand," he began, "that you two are unusually close." Anna smiled faintly. "We are one," she said, as though reciting a well-practiced line. Hargrove tilted his head. "In what sense?" "In every sense," Elspeth replied, her tone almost cheerful. The doctor spent the next hour asking questions. Some were simple. What was the first memory they shared? Did they dream the same dreams? Could one recall a thing the other had seen? Others were more peculiar. He asked them to close their eyes and tell him when he touched one of them, though, more often than not, both would respond at once. At one point, he asked Anna to hum a tune only she knew. Elspeth's lips moved with the melody in perfect synchrony. Helen watched from the doorway, her unease growing. There was nothing unkind in Hargrove's manner, but there was a hunger in his curiosity, as if each answer only deepened his need for more. When the session ended, Hargrove thanked them and promised to return. That night, he sat in his rented room, writing until well past midnight. His notes, later found in a leather-bound journal, were meticulous. The Turner children present a rare and possibly unique phenomenon. Their responses indicate a form of shared perception not accounted for in current medical literature. Whether physiological or of another nature entirely remains to be determined. Over the next week, Hargrove visited daily. He brought small instruments, a tuning fork, a blindfold, a metronome, and conducted what he called harmless trials. Sometimes he would speak softly to one twin while the other, across the room, would answer. Other times, he would ask them to draw without looking, their pencils tracing mirrored shapes on separate sheets of paper. Word of these visits spread quickly. Some townsfolk were pleased that an educated man was taking an interest, others muttered about meddling outsiders. Reverend Carter, upon hearing of the experiments, paid a visit to Helen and urged her to end them. "Such things invite trouble," he warned. "And trouble has a way of answering its invitation." But Helen found herself torn. Part of her wanted to send Hargrove away, to protect the girls from becoming a spectacle. Yet another part, the quieter, more dangerous part, wanted to know the truth as much as he did. On the 6th day, Hargrove arrived with a peculiar request. He wished to separate the twins entirely for a short period, Anna at the boarding house with him, Elspeth at home with Helen, to see if the connection could be broken. The suggestion unsettled Helen deeply. The twins had never spent a night apart. But before she could refuse, Anna spoke. "We'll do it," she said. That night, the experiment was carried out. In the boarding house, Anna sat across from Hargrove, answering his questions with calm precision. At home, Elspeth lay awake in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. At precisely 11 o'clock, Hargrove asked Anna to describe what Elspeth was doing. Without hesitation, she replied, "She's counting the cracks in the ceiling, but she's only pretending. She's thinking of the harbor." Helen, sitting beside Elspeth, felt her skin prickle. She had said nothing aloud, yet moments earlier, she had seen the girl's eyes drift toward the window, toward the dark, frozen water beyond. By morning, both girls were back together, moving through the house as though nothing had happened. Hargrove, however, was different. There was a brightness in his eyes now, and when Helen asked what he had learned, he merely said, "Enough to know this is no trick." His final visit came 2 days later. He told Helen he would be returning to Boston to write his findings. "The world must know of this," he said. Helen only nodded. But deep inside, she felt a shadow of dread, the sense that once the story left Ashford Bay, it would never truly belong to them again. When Hargrove boarded the train, the twins stood on the platform, watching without waving. He tipped his hat as the carriage door closed, but neither girl returned the gesture. Only after the train had disappeared into the white horizon did they turn to each other, their expressions unreadable. The last days of February brought a strange change to the air in Ashford Bay. The cold remained, but there was something else now, a brittle stillness, as if the town were holding its breath. The harbor lay under a thin crust of ice, broken only in places where the tide gnawed at it in restless rhythm. The gulls that usually screamed over the docks were fewer, their voices oddly distant. In the Turner household, the atmosphere was heavier still. Ever since Dr. Hargrove's visits had begun, a subtle shift had crept into the rhythm of the home. The girls were no less devoted to one another, but their silences were longer, their shared glances more unreadable. Helen found herself watching them the way one watches a candle flame in a draught, wondering if it would flicker, or if it would burn on in defiance of the wind. On the morning of Hargrove's final visit, the frost on the windows was so thick it made the outside world seem like a faded photograph. He arrived early, wearing his dark coat and scarf, his leather case in hand. There was no tuning fork, no blindfolds today. Just a notepad, a fountain pen, and an expression Helen couldn't quite name, something between triumph and regret. They sat in the parlor. Hargrove spoke in measured tones, thanking Helen for her hospitality, for allowing him to observe the girls. "It is no small thing," he said, "to open your home to inquiry. You may not realize the significance of what you have here." Helen's fingers tightened on the edge of her chair. She wanted to ask if the significance he spoke of would be a blessing or a curse. But before she could form the words, Elspeth answered for her. "It's not yours to take," the girl said. The room seemed to contract. Hargrove turned toward her slowly. "I'm not here to take," he said. "I'm here to understand." Anna, seated beside her sister, tilted her head. "And once you understand?" she asked. There was a pause. Hargrove did not smile. "Once I understand," he said, "I will tell others. Your story deserves to be told." Helen's breath caught. She realized then what had been troubling her from the start, the knowledge that stories, once loosed into the world, could not be called back. They grew, they changed, and sometimes they devoured those who had birthed them. The conversation ended without resolution. Hargrove stood, collected his coat, and said he would depart by the afternoon train. The twins watched him from the doorway as he stepped out into the brittle sunlight, his boots cracking the thin crust of snow along the path. That afternoon, the station was nearly empty. A weak sun hung low over the frozen marshes, casting pale gold on the iron rails. The Turner family had not come to see him off, at least, not officially. Helen had insisted there was no need, that he knew his way. But as Hargrove waited on the platform, two small figures appeared at the far end. Anna and Elspeth walked slowly toward him, their steps perfectly in sync. They stopped several feet away, close enough to speak without raising their voices, but far enough that they could have been mistaken for onlookers. "You'll write about us," Anna said. "Yes," Hargrove replied. "You'll change things," Elspeth added. He studied them both. "Perhaps. But change is not always harm." The twins exchanged a glance, one of those silent exchanges that seemed to carry more than words could hold. When they looked back at him, their faces were expressionless. The whistle of the train echoed across the snow. Steam rose in plumes from the approaching engine, curling into the pale air. Hargrove picked up his case. "Will you remember us?" Anna asked. "Always," he said. Elspeth's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Then we'll remember you too." The train slowed, brakes screeching against the rails. Passengers disembarked, others climbed aboard. Hargrove stepped toward the open carriage door, then paused. "Goodbye," he said, tipping his hat. The twins did not wave. He boarded, the door shut, and the train began to move, gathering speed as it left the platform. The girls stood perfectly still, watching until the last carriage blurred into the white horizon. Only then did they turn, side by side, and walk back the way they had come. That night, Helen noticed something unusual. The girls retired to their room early, without prompting. She passed by their door once, hearing the low murmur of their voices, a sound she was used to, but then a moment later, silence. A deep, absolute silence that seemed to press against the walls. When she looked in on them later, she found them asleep in their narrow bed, faces turned toward each other, hands clasped. Yet in the faint light from the window, Helen thought she saw something in their expressions, not innocence, not peace, but something older, stranger, like the remnants of a conversation that had not been meant for human ears. In Boston, weeks later, Dr. Hargrove would write to a colleague, "The Turner phenomenon remains, to my mind, the most compelling case of dual consciousness, or perhaps a single consciousness in two vessels, that I have encountered. Yet there is something I cannot quantify, something beyond the reach of physiology or psychology." I left Ashford Bay with more questions than answers, and with the lingering suspicion that the subjects understood far more about me than I about them. The letter was never sent. It was found among his papers after his death the following year. In Ashford Bay, life moved on. Spring came, the harbor thawed, and the gulls returned to their noisy dominion over the docks. The Turner girls grew older, their legend fading into the background hum of the town's many half-forgotten tales. But every so often, when strangers passed through, someone would lower their voice and say, "You should have seen them, the twins who could share a thought." And those who had seen them, truly seen them, never told the story quite the same way twice. For some swore that on that last day at the station, as the train pulled away, the girls had not been standing on the platform at all. They had been inside the carriage. Standing behind Hargrove. Watching him. And smiling. The bay was always stillest at dawn, when the tide seemed to hesitate before surrendering to the pull of the open sea. On most mornings, the fishermen of St. Bellamy would be the first to cut through that glassy surface, their oars slicing in rhythm, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the fog. But in the weeks after the twins' departure, those early hours carried an unshakable wrongness. At first, the changes were small, subtle enough that only those with a lifetime of familiarity with the water could sense them. The echo of oars seemed to last a fraction longer before fading. The gulls that circled above the inlet grew fewer, as though repelled by something only they could perceive. And, most unnerving of all, voices began to drift across the bay before the village itself had stirred, whispers that arrived without any visible source, carried on a wind that seemed to rise from the water rather than from the shore. It was Mr. Gable, the oldest fisherman in St. Bellamy, who first dared to speak of it aloud. Over a tin mug of coffee at the dockside, he told the others that the whispers were not random. "They're calling," he said, his voice gravelly from age and salt. "Not to us, but to each other. Across the water." The other men exchanged glances, their faces arranged in the careful neutrality of those who do not want to invite ridicule, but neither did they wish to be left alone with their thoughts. There was an unspoken agreement in St. Bellamy. Strange occurrences were acknowledged in passing but never examined too closely. Such things had a way of expanding when given too much attention. And yet, attention was exactly what the bay seemed to demand. Within days, the fishermen's reports grew stranger. One claimed that while hauling in his nets, he saw a figure moving beneath the water's surface, not swimming, but walking, its steps deliberate, its head tilted upward toward the boats. Another swore that his anchor chain had been tugged from below, hard enough to rock the hull, though the water around him was perfectly calm. The stories would have been dismissed as superstition, had it not been for the incident with the bell. The harbor's bell, mounted on a weathered wooden frame near the end of the longest pier, had been silent for decades. Its rope had frayed away, its clapper rusted into place. Yet one morning, before sunrise, it rang, once, sharp and resonant, the sound cutting through the fog like a blade. The villagers who heard it described the tone in the same way, not like metal striking metal, but like something hollow being struck from within. By the time they reached the pier, the bell was still. No footprints marked the wet boards. No hand could have reached it without being seen from the shore. The incident spread quickly, whispered in kitchens and over shop counters, until it reached the ears of Mrs. Linton, the schoolteacher. And it was she who first connected the sound to the twins. She recalled a story, one that her mother had told her, about how, in the late 18th century, a pair of sisters had lived on the far side of the bay. They were said to be two parts of a whole, their bond so complete that they could speak entire thoughts with only a glance. When one fell ill and died, the other walked into the bay at low tide and did not return. The villagers searched, but no body was ever found. In the weeks that followed, the harbor bell rang at odd hours. Some claimed it was the surviving sister, calling out for the part of herself she had lost. Mrs. Linton, though not superstitious, felt a prickling certainty that the recent events were not random. The twins, our twins, had not simply left St. Bellamy. They had left something behind, something incomplete, and the bay was now a conduit for what could not be severed. Rumors multiplied. A dockhand swore he saw two figures standing in the fog near the lighthouse, their outlines blurred yet perfectly symmetrical. Children spoke of hearing footsteps pacing outside their bedroom windows at night, always in pairs, always moving in unison. And then there was the fisherman's wife who claimed she had heard a conversation, half in her own voice, half in the voice of someone she had never met, echoing up from the tide pools. By now, even those who scoffed at superstition began to avoid the water before sunrise. The tavern near the dockside saw more business as men lingered over drinks, reluctant to make the morning crossing. And for those who did, there was a new ritual, touching the weathered post at the end of the pier before pushing off, as though seeking the blessing, or the protection, of something unseen. The town's minister, Reverend Hale, addressed the matter in his Sunday sermon. He spoke of fear as a snare, a temptation to be resisted. The sea is God's creation, he declared, and it holds no voices but the ones we give it. His words were steady, but those who knew him best noted the way his gaze kept drifting toward the bay through the chapel window, as though expecting something to rise from the horizon. For a time, the whispers quieted. Or perhaps the villagers simply learned to ignore them. But then came the night of the red tide. It began like any other evening, with the sun sinking low and the fog creeping inland. But when the moon rose, the water glowed, not the soft silver of reflected light, but a deep, unnatural crimson. The fishermen knew it as an algal bloom, a rare but natural occurrence. Yet in St. Bellamy, where the memory of the twins lingered like a shadow, the sight took on a more sinister meaning. On that night, several villagers reported hearing not just whispers, but laughter, two voices, weaving around each other in perfect sync, carried from one end of the bay to the other. And in the morning, the harbor bell rang again. Twice. The lighthouse of St. Bellamy had always been an object of quiet respect. Perched on a rocky outcrop at the mouth of the bay, it was a skeletal tower of weathered brick and iron, its beams sweeping the waters with unblinking precision. Generations of keepers had lived and died in its narrow rooms, their lives measured by the turning of that great lamp and the endless pulse of the sea. For the past 12 years, the keeper had been a man named Elias Venn. He was tall, gaunt, and spoke rarely, not out of secrecy, the villagers said, but because the sea had long ago taught him the value of silence. His eyes had the distant look of someone who had spent more hours staring into fog than into another person's face. Most days he came to shore only for supplies, his visits short and purposeful, his presence an afterthought in the hum of the village. It was during one of these visits, in the third week after the red tide, that Elias broke his usual pattern. He walked into the tavern, not the general store, not the post office, but the tavern, and stood in the doorway until the room grew quiet. Men turned in their seats. The smell of salt water clung to him, sharper than the beer and smoke in the air. Without asking, he moved to the corner table, the one where the fishermen usually played cards, and rested his hands on the scarred wood. "I have something to say," he began. The words landed like stones in the stillness. Elias did not look at anyone directly. His gaze remained fixed on the far wall, as though reading something only he could see. "You've all heard the stories," he continued, "about voices on the water, and the bell ringing when no one's near it. You've heard about them. The twins." No one spoke, but a chair creaked as someone shifted uneasily. "I've heard them too," Elias said. "But not the way you have." He paused, and in that pause the tavern seemed to shrink. Even the fire in the hearth crackled more softly, as though straining to listen. 3 nights ago, Elias went on, I was tending the lamp. Fog thick as milk, no wind. I stepped outside to check the south wall, and I saw 2 shapes on the rocks below. Standing side by side. They were looking up at me. I could see their faces. A murmur rippled through the room. Elias's expression did not change. They didn't speak. Not then. But the air around them was wrong. The waves were moving toward them, not the shore. Like the whole bay was leaning to hear what they might say. And then, here, his voice faltered, just for a moment. And then I felt it. Not in my ears, but in my chest. Like a word without sound, pressed into my bones. They told me something. What? Someone whispered. That they were waiting, Elias said. And that the waiting was almost over. A long silence followed. No one seemed willing to break it. Finally, old Mr. Gable cleared his throat. Waiting for what? Elias's gaze shifted then, for the first time, and the look in his eyes unsettled even the most weathered men in the room. I don't think it's for us to decide, he said. But they wanted me to tell you, to tell all of you, that when the bell rings 3 times, it will be too late. With that, Elias stood. He did not linger for questions. He walked out into the night, the tavern door closing softly behind him, and returned to the lighthouse. The villagers argued long after he was gone. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely man too long cut off from the world. Others swore by his sincerity, pointing out that Elias Venn had never once been known to invent a tale. But whether they believed him or not, the warning took root. People began to listen for the bell in a way they never had before. Its absence became as heavy as its presence. 2 nights later, in the black hours before dawn, the bell rang once. It was enough to rouse the entire village. Lights flared in windows. Doors opened. Some ran to the pier, only to find the water calm, the fog dense, the bell still. There was no second strike. No third. Just that single note, hanging in memory like a blade suspended in air. When word of it reached the lighthouse, Elias was said to have looked out to sea and muttered only one thing, they're early. It came not with a storm, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the skin itch, as though the air itself is holding its breath. 3 days had passed since the first strike of the bell. The village had settled into a tense watchfulness, every ear tuned to the sound that might follow. But the sea had been calm, the weather unremarkable. Even the gulls had returned, their cries sharp against the sky. People began to tell themselves it had been nothing, a fluke of wind, perhaps, or the settling of the old iron clapper. And then, on the 4th night, the second toll came. It was just past midnight. The moon was a thin, pale smear behind a haze of cloud. Most of the village slept, but not all. There were those who had not truly slept since the first toll, lying awake in their beds, waiting. When it came, it was not loud. Not the blaring, metallic crash one might expect. It was deep, so deep it seemed to resonate not in the ears, but in the chest, as if the heart itself had been struck. The sound rolled across the bay, steady, deliberate. 1 strike. Then the silence afterward, vast and listening. And then, a change. Some swore they heard it before they saw it, the shift in the water. The way the ripples moved against the wind. Others spoke of the light, faint, cold, moving just beneath the surface like moonlight trapped in the deep. It began far out in the bay, a dim shimmer, growing brighter, drawing nearer. The fishermen were the first to gather at the pier, lanterns in hand. They leaned over the edge, peering into the black water. What they saw, most would later refuse to describe. Shapes, they said. Long, slow shapes, gliding just beneath the surface. Not fish, not anything that moved like fish. They did not dart or scatter. They moved with purpose. In pairs. Always in pairs. The light beneath them pulsed faintly, in time with something unseen. And from somewhere far out in the bay, faint but undeniable, came the sound of children's laughter. It was not the laughter of joy. It was hollow, drawn out, the way a voice might sound if it traveled too far to still be human. Someone whispered, "The twins." The word spread along the pier, muttered, repeated, until it seemed the bay itself might hear it. Then the light faded. The shapes sank deeper, vanishing into darkness. The laughter stopped. And the silence returned, thicker now, heavier. By dawn, word had reached Elias Venn at the lighthouse. He was waiting at the dock before the messenger could speak. His face was drawn, his eyes red as though from sleeplessness, or from staring too long into something no man should see. "It's begun," he said simply. "What has?" the boy asked. But Elias only shook his head and looked out over the bay. From that moment, the village changed. Doors were bolted before sunset. Nets went untended. Children were kept indoors. And yet, no one left. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was something else, a kind of binding, unspoken, that kept them all within reach of the bell. 2 tolls now. 1 left. And everyone knew, without knowing how, that when the 3rd came, the waiting would be over.